Please welcome Vice President of Federal Affairs for WSWA, Cody Tucker.
Today, our speaker is going to take a closer look at how Congress inadvertently deregulated intoxicants made from hemp, what it means for today's market, and what the landscape of the future looks like. He'll examine the 2018 Farm Bill, how it set conditions for today's intoxicants, market challenges, and where we go from here. Please welcome to the stage Director of State Advocacy and Public Policy for the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, Chris Lindsay.
Well, hey everybody, great to be here. I want to thank the organizers for having me along. This is super exciting to see the developments that have been taking place. It's really historic to be here at an event like this, talking about these products and their potential to be going along with other adult beverages. This is historic, and I'm super thrilled to be here. So, well, we're going to talk about kind of how we got to this point, what might come from this time in history, and I think the future is bright, both for alcohol distributors that want to participate in this space and the folks that are putting together the THC infusions drawn and derived from hemp. So good stuff. All right, let me see if I can get on track here. So, well, let me introduce myself. My name's Chris Lindsay. I'm an attorney. I've been at this since 2006. I'm also a felon, a federal felon. Not many people actually know that. I got started as a patient, then moved into what at the time in Montana was the medical marijuana industry. This was before we have the kind of protections that we have now, and the DEA came into my state and raided about 28 businesses, all in about a 2-hour period, including the one I started. Nothing will change your perspective faster than having your workers zip-tied outside your facility while DEA officers in hazmats are emptying out your building. And so I tend to be a little bit more conservative about this stuff. I don't quite glow with the same enthusiasm I think some people do, but I am very excited about what's going on here. So I've been, like I said, I've kind of been in this space since then. After I was a criminal defense attorney before I became an owner of that business. Then after all the dust settled, I ended up in advocacy. So I started working for Marijuana Policy Project for many years. I helped legalize Illinois among other states, and that was really exciting. Now I'm doing a lot of federal work, but also working in places like Missouri, Illinois, Florida, and Arizona. So lots and lots going on. So what we have today is a situation in which we have these products that have emerged onto the scene. It really sort of came into focus following the Farm Bill or the Agriculture Improvement Act. And so I want to just give a quick overview of kind of all that happened and where that seems to have left us here today. So leading up to 2014, we had a big change in the tobacco industry. And when FDA started to get a lot more control over tobacco, that really changed the landscape pretty significantly in Kentucky, which is home to Mitch McConnell. And he was pretty tied in with the tobacco industry in that state. It really left a lot of questions. Folks that had been very active in that industry found themselves not able to participate like they had. And so Mitch McConnell was looking for ways to provide to a lot of those farmers. And so they started to look at hemp. And so in 2014, they created an exception to what up until that time was always marijuana. If it was a cannabis plant, it was illegal to the federal government except in very rare exceptions. And so what Congress did is they said, okay, we're going to come up with this new thing. It's called hemp. And they defined hemp to separate it from marijuana by saying, well, if it's got only trace amounts of the psychoactive ingredient, delta-9 THC, we're not going to treat it the way we would treat marijuana. And that was the differentiator. So that was 2014. Then we had 2018. Again, it's the Farm Bill. Again, Mitch McConnell had a huge amount of influence in that bill at that time. And so they sort of tweaked the definition slightly, and they said, you know what, we're not only going to count hemp as separate from marijuana, we're going to say anything that's derived from hemp also no longer going to be treated like marijuana. Well, that sure sounded like a good deal. And what in 2014 was really a test program, more for educational institutions, in 2018 they said, this is just now a crop. So if you're a farmer in the United States, hemp is now an option. And so it was really in the wake of that that people started looking at what the potential was for this plant. And it wasn't very long before chemists said, you know what, we can take a lot of that, the constituents of that hemp plant, and we can do conversions and take what a lot of folks were saying, you know, CBD is readily available in the hemp plant. We can take that into a laboratory, we can convert it into the very same intoxicants that are available in the marijuana plant, but hey, those are derivatives, right? And so they started saying there's potential here. We can now reach markets that we had never done before. We're not bound by a lot of the laws that had sort of grown up around marijuana. And so it seemed like we were really kind of moving into a new direction. So let me see where I got to get back on my track here. Now, a couple of things I do want to say, and this is where the conservative part of me sort of will separate me from others in this industry. And one is to say that you'll hear a very common refrain that these products are now, you know, legal in all 50 states. And that's actually not the case. If you talk to the federal government, there are two agencies that really have jurisdiction over these kinds of products. One is the FDA, one is the DEA. And to both of those agencies, if you were to ask them, are these products legal? The answer you would get from them is no. Now, this could be tested in court. There are ways for us to maybe explore that further. But the FDA has been pretty clear that they consider Delta 8 THC, which sort of is the first big intoxicant to emerge out of this program, they call it an adulterant. And so to the FDA, not supposed to be doing this. To the DEA, they consider it to be a synthetic, which there's a whole body of law called the Analog Act, which says if you synthesize something into an analog of THC, they consider that a Schedule I controlled substance. And so there's a version of what is going on here that says it actually doesn't matter what happened in the Farm Bill because it didn't really change the law, at least not to the federal government. The situation that we have today is a really peculiar one, and one in which I think federal law enforcement and the folks over at the FDA would look at this more as not a change in the law, but just we're just not enforcing it like we used to. Either way, there's an open lane. We do not sit up at night worried that our facilities are going to get raided by the DEA any longer. We don't have problems with the Postal Service shipping this stuff across state lines. And so where does that leave us? Well, it does beg a lot of questions, but I want to sort of cut through to where some folks might be wondering where I'm going with all this. So let me start by saying that if you're an alcohol distributor and you are considering or you are now including THC infusions in your products, first of all, thank you for your involvement. This is huge. This is actually historic. I think that it points us in the direction that legalization ought to go. Because I can tell you that today, the way things actually are, if the chips just simply fell, if somebody came out and said, you know what, war's over, it's legal federally, we don't care anymore, we would already have a problem. And that problem is that the FDA thinks that it regulates these products. And that's not going to be good for folks in this industry. And it's because the FDA has a very, very specific system behind how they approve foods and drugs. And they've already come out, even with CBD, which is non-intoxicating, they've come out and said, we're not for approving this stuff. And I don't know if you've checked, but the FDA doesn't really get involved in intoxicants very much. I don't think it's a good fit. They do pharmaceutical medications, they do food, they do supplements, they do medical devices. They don't do intoxicants. And I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of intoxicants, especially when they're derived from this plant. And so, to me, the solution is not the FDA, it's TTB. Well, this is where we are when we're talking about beverages. It's a natural fit. And so that's why I'm a huge fan of having alcohol distributors including these products for a number of reasons. And one of them is that these products go where adult beverages go. They go where the 21 or older crowd is, and that's a really good fit. I'm very concerned when we have folks that are producing basically candy, and it looks like candy, it tastes like candy, and it's high potency. I think that's a recipe for disaster. And I can go into why I think all those reasons are, but the problem is if you're operating in a system where there are no rules, you're going to be judged by the worst actors that are playing in that space. And we don't want to be there because the DEA, the FDA, and Congress, they are not interested in telling 3 out of 4 states that they can't do this anymore. There is no will at that level for that type of response. They don't have the money, they don't have the resources, and they're not going to have the support of voters. But if you're operating a system where this stuff goes direct to kids, those kids go to the ER, the state says this is a problem, we don't know how to deal with this problem, you don't want to be in that space because suddenly now the DEA is not so nervous because they can come in as heroes, right? They can say, we're protecting kids. We've got attorneys general asking us for help, and that's a much worse situation for businesses trying to operate in that space. So to me, the sweet spot for folks in this space is to be working within a state system. I'm not going to pick any one in particular because I actually don't think it matters that much, but you have to have a state that says, here are rules, and these guys are compliant with them. Because if it ever comes to the point where the DEA says, you know what, maybe we do need to do something because we don't think the Farm Bill changed anything, we think these are synthetics, you want to be on the side that says the state's good with what we're up to. So I think that that's really important right now. All right, I'm going to try to get through this and then leave it open to questions because I imagine there are probably quite a few. Now, I've talked about the DEA. I also think the same can be said with the FDA. And we've started to see letters go out. Now, first of all, let me just say that unlike the DEA, the FDA's enforcement abilities are pretty limited. They can't really issue fines. They're not throwing people in jail. That's not what the FDA does. They write letters. And we've seen some letters go out over the past year or so. It used to be that if you were making medical claims, that's what could put you sideways with the FDA. But the more recent letters we're seeing go more towards products that are just simply intoxicating. And we saw one recently that was Delta 8. So there is some risk there that the FDA will step up. But I can tell you that this is not the priority, that beverages are really in a little bit of a different space, and for several reasons. One is they do go where the adults go. The second is that you can't really overdose on it the same way that you can, say, with candy, especially those high potency candies that are saying, hey, we're 300 milligrams. That's an open invitation to kids getting in big trouble. And that's not the case when we're talking about the kinds of beverages that are here at this show or really this whole segment, because we're talking 2 milligrams, 5 milligrams per can. First of all, a kid has to get the can open. They have to drink the whole thing and then go drink 6 more of them. That's not happening as a practical matter. And so while the FDA technically may say, hey, we don't like what you're up to, we're not seeing any enforcement happening against these kinds of products. Now let me switch over to the alcohol distributors. So the question would be, hey, you know what, I've got this distribution license. Last thing I want to do is get in trouble with the federal government. But the reality is that TTB only has jurisdiction over alcoholic beverages. They don't have jurisdiction over cannabis-infused beverages. And so TTB is not really spending any time at all looking at these kinds of products, right? So that's great news. And like I said, FDA isn't seeing these types of products in the same light that they might with these sort of candies that I do think put a lot of us at risk. So again, I applaud the work that's happening here by the companies that are producing these products and with the alcohol distributors that are including them in their product lines. All right, so I did cover quite a bit of this already. I think we can probably move past this. So we've had different reactions to how the law changed. I've already kind of gone through. USDA got the growing, so they already put some provisions in place when it comes to the production. FDA technically doesn't get thrilled with these products because they haven't approved them yet. That's their wheelhouse. DEA, they checked out of the war on marijuana about 10 years ago, actually. The Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment basically came along where it said if you're compliant with your state medical marijuana laws, then they don't have any funding to go after you. They went to court on that and they said, hey judge, if you're telling us we can't do anything about medical marijuana, we can't do anything about adult use either because there's no difference between these things. And the judge basically just said, that's not my problem. If you have an issue with that, go to Congress. And so DEA basically took its ball and went home. I don't know anybody that's worried about the DEA anymore, especially the ones that are compliant with some type of state law. Now, states reacted across a broad range of different kinds of responses. For the most part, what they did is they took their laws and they mirrored what Congress did with the definition of hemp. And often they didn't really see that, oh yeah, that means that there could be intoxicants that come out of this as well. And so some of them got ahead of it, but not very many. Others really didn't react at all, and so there's just kind of this gray area. And then some actually set up regulatory systems for these products as well. And so that's why you have, if you go and talk to folks that have these booths here today, they'll sort of have a range of states that they operate in, and it's because they're trying to look at, well, what's the landscape? You know, where am I at in this? And increasingly, I think folks are finding that states don't seem to have a problem, and certainly the public is embracing this on a pretty broad scale. Now, the marijuana community from which I came from really sort of seized on this and looked at it as a form of legalization and said, hey, these products, we're just legal in 50 states. You know, I don't agree with that. I think we're in a situation where we're just not getting any law enforcement action because law enforcement has other things to do. Fentanyl is a much more serious problem for the DEA to deal with. They're not interested in telling Minnesota they can't do whatever it is they're doing with their regulatory system. So to me, given my background where I ended up in trouble with the DEA, the number one thing you can do to protect your business is to be compliant with state law, because that gives you some place to go when the DEA shows up and says, hey, we don't like what you're up to. You say, go talk to the folks who opened the lane for me to operate the way that I am. I'm compliant with what the state's up to. That's why I think it's really important. It's one of my mantras. So I'm not as glowing about this as some of the folks in the marijuana community who are just sort of ready to call the war over. I think that that's not quite where we are, but I just think that because there's no interest in Congress, there's no interest in these agencies to push against the states, that seems to keep this lane open. All right, where are we at here now? All right, so there is a debate that's going on around the Farm Bill. And so, again, the Farm Bill seemed to open this lane up in 2014 and then 2018. We're back into this discussion now. organizations like mine are lobbying members of Congress, and I want to explain that just a little bit. And I'm absolutely open to questions that you might have about what we're up to. But what started to happen, let me give you a little bit of a story. So I started working for trade groups a number of years ago, about 3 years ago, and we started to have members who are these sort of way overly regulated state marijuana businesses where states treat it like uranium, and which is ridiculous, but they're overcompensating for all the years that they've been sort of down on marijuana as a product. And so, these businesses are saying, hey, you know what, I was driving into work this morning and I stopped at the gas station and there's Delta 8 on the shelf and it says it's basically the same thing as marijuana. What's up with that? And so it sort of started as a bit of a curiosity, but didn't really take hold with a lot of these businesses. Then we started to hear reports about, hey, you know what, there's some potentially bad things that can happen from these products because they don't have to go through the testing. There's no regulatory sideboards at all. So there were concerns that if kids start to get sick or adults are getting sick, the general public doesn't really understand the difference between these products, and often the marketing really kind of exploits that to a certain extent. So there was some concern that, wait a minute, we don't want to have folks who spend millions of dollars to try to meet state requirements sort of get blamed because they're out in the light on these products that are hurting people. And so that's when things started to ramp up. But Attach, the organization I'm a part of, didn't really get into this until we started to see folks basically trying to make the case that states actually can't regulate these products because they're preempted by the federal law. And so we had folks going into court and saying, hey, Congress did this in the 2018 Farm Bill. They said these products are now available. States, you can't limit these products any longer. And that's a real serious problem because, again, the DEA doesn't think the law really changed. They still see these products as Schedule I controlled substances. The FDA says this hasn't really ever been approved for use. And so if states can't regulate this, then who is, right? Eventually, the federal government would step in, and we don't want to be subject to what the DEA might do with these products. That's a disaster. And so we felt that we had to get involved in order to make clear states absolutely can regulate this just like they regulate cannabis and marijuana. And so that's how we got into this, and think that that's important. So we're participating in that right now. All right, let's see where we are here. I think that's probably about what I wanted to cover. Now, in terms of where do we go from here, yeah, I've kind of covered all this stuff. So in terms of, yeah, what's going to happen from here, Congress keeps kicking the can down the road when we're talking about the Farm Bill. I think if the Farm Bill does not change, it's probably going to be a bump for the industry because the perception the public has is that, oh, that means that the lane will stay open. But I think the reality is the lane's going to be open no matter what because, like I said, the agencies that actually have jurisdiction over these products don't think the landscape really changed all that much, and nobody's doing any enforcement now. I don't think anybody has had their products flagged by the Postal Service and said you can't do this across state lines, even though FDA sent many letters out saying you can't send it across state lines. U.S. Postal Service is not doing any enforcement. I don't see the DEA in there shutting any of these businesses down. So yeah, I think we probably can do some questions. So I do think that the Farm Bill is going to address this. I know there are others here who think they won't. I don't think either way that's going to affect or should affect what states do. Because on the marijuana side of things, we're 100% illegal. Everybody agrees with that, and yet states have no problem regulating. And in fact, We've had memos written basically saying states, if you're going to do any kind of marijuana-related activity, you better regulate. So I think that's really the world that we live in today. So, all right, well, that was a bit of a whirlwind. Let's see what questions that we might have.
I've been told by some grocery retailers that they're waiting on the FDA for the D9 THC beverage space. What is the FDA stance on it? It's not entirely clear. And is there something happening in that regard?
So, okay, so the question is the DEA going to step up? There are some folks in the retail space saying we're waiting for the FDA. As far as I know, the FDA has not moved on this. And part of the problem that we have, this is why this is not a good fit for the FDA, because the FDA has already allowed or granted the right for businesses to market Delta-9 THC and CBD. These are companies that went through the new drug process. They spent millions of dollars and spent many, many years to get this exclusive right. And even then, it's very limited what they can do with those products. It can only be for medical benefit. So here comes an intoxicants industry saying, hey, we can totally do this. The FDA actually doesn't have the capability of saying, okay, we're just going to blow off what we just told these companies, and now y'all can just do this and grow it in your basement or whatever they're going to do. And so having the FDA be the regulatory authority requires new law. It requires a bunch more employees and a bunch more money. And there's nobody in Congress right now plotting how to make the FDA bigger and more powerful. And so that's why we really need to segment this stuff and say, hey, if we're not out here making medical claims and selling this as medicine, it belongs to TTB, because TTB knows exactly how to regulate intoxicants. They can tax it. They can make sure people are compliant with their laws. So the reason why I'm a big fan of what's going on here is because we are training the public that this is where this belongs. And it's a model that we've had for generations that's been successful. I mean, look at how great this event is. It's a sign of just how powerful this model can be. So that's where we need to go. Any other questions?
Can you explain a little bit more in detail the difference between the D8 and D9 and what's legal and what's not legal? Like,
Sure. So yeah, what's the difference between D8 and D9? These are different isomers of tetrahydrocannabinol, so THC. That's the intoxicant that lives in the marijuana plant. And Delta-9 THC is the one that if you take a precursor called THCA, that is what you would naturally find in the cannabis plant. If you subject it to heat, I think it's 220 degrees or more, which you can do by lighting it on fire or putting it in a vape, that will convert it into Delta-9 THC. And if you consume it, you'll get high if you get enough of it. Delta-8 is also found in the cannabis plant in sort of trace amounts. So it's not very common. In a term that's been developed when we're starting to talk about the non-Delta-9 THC forms are novel cannabinoids. And there are many, dozens I think, is probably where we're at right now. They also will have the same effect on the human body. So we have an endocannabinoid system. Those molecules happen to just perfectly fit a receptor that's in our bodies, and when they do, if you have enough of those molecules hitting enough of those receptors, you start to feel an effect. And just like Delta-9 THC can have that effect on us, these other forms of THC, many of them, will also unlock that receptor. Now, not all of them are as effective as Delta-9 THC, so maybe they unlock it, but not as good. And I think that's, I forgot the term, but they're not as effective at that process. And so Delta-8, I think there's been some research that says it's about 75% as effective as Delta-9. So folks notice that, hey, it's not as potent, and some people like that. They like it not affecting them as much. There are other versions of the THC molecule that are more potent, and so we're seeing those emerge as well. What's that? Yeah, so according to the federal government, none of that stuff, when it's synthesized, is legal. It's really the state programs that you would want to look to where they start to differentiate. And everybody right now is thinking about Delta 8 because they're a few years behind the times. I think D9's probably emerged more as the go-to, even in the sort of intoxicants production space, because everybody knows Delta 9 THC, and that's highly sought after.
If you're in a state where marijuana is still just illegal, there's no medical, there's nothing, and you walk around and they're telling you you can sell these products in that state, what's your response to that?
My response is you better change state law real fast if you're going to expect to be out in the open selling your product, because if you're operating in a state that says we absolutely don't support this, then you have no protection whatsoever. If the federal government shows up and says, yeah, ever since we started writing comments in the Federal Register in the wake of the Farm Bill, we said this stuff isn't legal. You synthesize the CBD molecule and turn it into something else, that's the Schedule 1 to the DEA. So that operator is basically saying, what? That I guess if they get in trouble and go to court, they might have some defenses. I think it's a terrible place to be. I've been there, and it doesn't work as much of a business plan. And so I think that if you're operating in one of those states, you need to come up with something. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have necessarily the kind of full-blown, overburdensome system that we've seen in a lot of states, but you've got to have a lane there somewhere. I think it's very, very important.
So that leads into my question. It's the same state. But building a system for regulation in the state, do you think that that actually pushes full marijuana legalization further back? If we're lobbying and pushing for the regulation of these products, of these intoxicants, do you think that we're pushing marijuana legalization further down the road? Because we're putting all of our effort into there, we're setting up this system. Are we kicking that can further down the road by pushing and lobbying in our states for regulation of these types of
It's a good question, right. So if we open the door to hemp intoxicants, does that make it harder to pass a full-blown regulatory system for cannabis? I would say it's definitely not what happened in Minnesota, right? They opened the door for hemp intoxicants, and within the next legislative cycle, we have all the rest of it. So I don't know that that really happens. I don't know that we have necessarily the luxury of sitting around and waiting to find out. I think if we already have these products on the market, you've got to have a system behind them. And honestly, I think once consumers start to get exposed to these products, they're ready for more, right? And why should they be denied these other natural products if they're taking the synthetic version of it? I mean, but that's lobbying and all the stuff that goes with campaigning. So, any other questions? All right, well, hearing none, I really appreciate you showing up and hearing this, and definitely hit me up if you have any questions afterward.